Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents All the Little Moments by G. Benson, narrated by Cat Gould. Chapter 1. The car turned down a quiet street, and Anna blinked rapidly as she realised it was her parents already. Her neck ached from sitting so stiffly, and she turned awkwardly in the passenger seat. In spite of herself, a smile tugged at her lips. Hayley lay sprawled over in the back, seatbelt digging into her neck. The normally poised and put-together lawyer slept with her mouth hung open, and there was a slight sign of drool. The last 14 hours had been a kind of hell, and both of them were exhausted. Swallowing heavily, Anna looked back to the front and clenched her fingers together in her lap. She kept her eyes off her father, scared to look at the expression on his face as he pulled into the driveway. The car had been eerily silent the entire drive from the airport. There were no words for this situation. Now, with the engine cut off, the silence somehow became even more oppressive. Heart racing, Anna let out a long, slow breath. The house looked as it always had, white and two-storey, with a simple front garden. It all looked the same, yet everything had changed. How could it be that just yesterday she'd been on a beach in the Gili Islands, Indonesia, relaxing with a mojito in her hand? Her father cleared his throat and opened his door, sliding out easily. As usual, Anna followed his lead, while Hayley unbuckled herself and got out on Anna's side, squeezing Anna's fingers in comfort. Anna returned the gesture as they stood next to the car, looking up at the house. If she could just stand out here and not go in, Anna thought, the reality that awaited her could be avoided. Maybe her brother, Jake, would actually be in there, smiling and asking what had taken her so long. He would wink at her and ask if the islands were as romantic as people said. Sally would laugh and punch her husband's arm, rolling her eyes. Except that wouldn't happen. She didn't want to go inside. The driver's side door slammed shut, and it made her jump. Warm fingers wrapped around her wrist, and she turned to see Hayley looking at her intently. "Sandra will want you," Anna sighed. She didn't know if she was ready to see her mother. The walk to the house felt like it took forever. She'd spoken to her mother for less than a minute from the hotel, as Sandra had sobbed the news into the phone. Unable to listen as shock crawled through her belly, Anna had simply handed the phone to Hayley. The front door pushed open too easily. Framed by the doorway, Sandra looked small, and at the sight of her red eyes and pinched face, Anna had to swallow past a lump in her throat. Sandra fell upon Anna, grabbing her like a lifeline, sobs hot against Anna's cheek, her fingertips digging into her skin. Anna wrapped her arms around her mother and ran her hand along her greying hair. Words failed, and the only sound was that of Sandra's grief. Anna felt a powerful urge to look around for Hayley, to find the person who always knew what to say, but her mother clung so hard there would be bruises. All there was to do was to sway gently and bite back the burning in her throat. "Nah!" Anna flinched at the contrast between the grief-stricken woman in her arms and the delighted shout of her nephew. Throughout the entire panicked trip off the island and the flight to Melbourne, she hadn't let herself think of the kids. Her mother took a shuddering breath, and Anna felt her tense as she straightened and wiped her eyes quickly. Jake's 15-month-old son, Toby, was making his way, step by step, down the stairs, ratty blue blanket clasped in one hand, while his other hand clung to the rail. He was grinning around his pacifier. As she watched the little boy, the spitting image of his father, stumble his way down, her smile was the closest to a genuine one she'd managed since receiving the news. Still, her heart ached, and her stomach twisted so badly she thought she'd be sick. Regardless, she took 2 long strides towards the bottom of the stairs and threw her arms wide. Toby all but fell into them, his little arms wrapping around her neck and his legs around her middle. He giggled as she cuddled him tightly, squeezing her eyes shut. Anna hugged him to her. Warm and solid in her arms, he gave another giggle. Out of the corner of her eye, Anna saw her father grimace and disappear down the hall to his study. The door closed with a solid thump. Toby pulled back from her neck, blanket clasped to his chest with one hand, while the other pulled out his pacifier with a pop. Serious big blue eyes looked at her, smile gone. "Nah," he said with a nod. He patted her face, pacifier poking her cheek, then broke into another smile. "Stay!" Even as her stomach twisted again and nausea rose in her throat, Anna nodded and returned the smile. "Of course I'm staying, Tobes. I've missed you." She squeezed him to her again, and he wiggled in her grasp, already wanting to get down and run around on his chubby legs. The moment his feet touched the ground, he was tugging her towards the living room. Anna looked up at her mother, pretending not to see the fresh tears on her cheeks. "Where's Ella?" "Upstairs." Sandra's voice was like a guitar string tuned too tight. "She's gone very quiet." A promise to return satisfied Toby, who ran to a pile of blocks, either to demolish or create. Halfway up the stairs, Anna stopped and turned to Hayley. "You okay here?" Hayley smiled slightly and nodded. "Sandra and I will have some tea." Anna nodded absently and continued up the stairs, thoughts already on her niece. Ella was an incredibly chatty child who loved her auntie. She'd been a surprise that had come into her brother's life when he and his fiancée were 25, the surprise that had turned Anna's jokester, loud brother into a ball of sap who looked at his tiny daughter like he'd destroy mountains for her. The change in him had been immediate as he held the tiny, squealing bundle. When he'd returned to Iraq after 3 months' leave, he'd done so with a new love of his life in his heart. Sudden, overwhelming anger made her screw up her fists. Her brother had survived a war that had claimed thousands, only to be killed years later, along with the wife he'd left active duty for, by one drunk arsehole in a car. Sometimes the world was a shitty place. Almost dizzy, she paused outside the room her parents kept for the kids. Taking a deep breath, she knocked and pushed the door open. "Ella?" There was only silence. She glanced around the room. A single bed all made up in pink in the corner, porta-cot along the wall, toys everywhere. A hiccup reached her ears, and her sight zeroed in on the neon-orange Converse shoes sticking out from under the bed. Anna almost smiled. She had bought Ella those shoes for her 6th birthday 5 weeks ago. Jake had laughed and rolled his eyes when he caught sight of them. That was the last time Anna had seen him. He'd said the shoes were ridiculous, that Ella would grow out of them too fast. Anna had punched his arm to shut him up, and Ella put them on straight away. The night Anna left, Jake sent a photo message of Ella, in bed, fast asleep, with her shoes still on. She had no idea how that was only 5 weeks ago. A lump formed in her throat, and she swallowed it down with difficulty. She slid under the bed on her back, wriggling until she lay shoulder to shoulder with Ella. Her niece was still, staring unblinkingly at the springs over their heads, so Anna didn't attempt to touch her. Ella's auburn hair was a mess around her head, and her eyes were intent on not looking at Anna. Somehow, the sprinkle of freckles over her nose had gotten even sweeter since Anna had last seen her. "Hey, Illabella," she said softly. Ella continued to stare straight up. Anna wasn't brilliant at this. Becoming an anaesthetist, rather than a doctor or a nurse, had been a choice she'd made because she wasn't great at conversation or small talk. When they lost a patient, she didn't have to give terrible news to parents and loved ones. She didn't need to know what to say, how to act. Kids had always been even more of an enigma to her. She could smile at a child in physical pain on her table and make them smile back enough to settle down before she put them to sleep. She could play games with kids, entertain them. She loved to sit with her niece and nephew and read them stories for a few hours, to make them giggle and watch their eyes widen at the things she told them. There had been the weekend she would never forget, when she had stupidly offered to take the kids so Jake and Sally could have 2 nights alone. But then she'd handed them back and returned to her life. There had been no permanence in that situation. She could handle a few nights, because then she got to give them back. But this? She didn't know how to do this. How to comfort a 6-year-old who had just lost her parents? She lifted a hand, grateful that the bed left a little room, and pushed a lock of hair behind Ella's ear. And that was all it took. Her little face crumbled and tears spilled as she turned into Anna's arms. The girl's frame was thin, and Anna wrapped her arms around her shaking, sobbing, almost gasping niece as best she could in the restricted space. "Our class rabbit died last year. He never came back." Anna's throat tightened, and she squeezed Ella closer. "Does that mean Mummy and Daddy aren't coming back too?" Ella's voice hiccuped over every word. Anna didn't know what to say, so she went with the truth. "No, they're not, honey." The joint funeral was beautiful and hideous all at once. Throughout, Ella clung to her grandparents and to Anna in turn, green eyes wide, barely speaking a word. In the middle of the service, Anna and Haley had to take Toby outside to play on the grass. The tiny boy didn't understand and didn't want to sit still. Sally's parents barely spoke a word to anybody, saying hello to the kids before retreating quickly. They had never bonded with their grandchildren, and Anna tried her best to be polite, while harbouring a feeling of resentment towards them. The stories Sally had shared didn't foster familial bonds. In spite of herself, Anna had kept looking for them at the wake, thinking that surely they would make an appearance. That night, Haley came up behind her in the kitchen, running a hand down her arm and making Anna jump and spin around. What was up with Sally's parents? Leaning back against the sink, Anna shrugged and crossed her arms. They're born-again Christians. Haley's eyes widened. Oh, yeah. She pulled Haley in for a kiss, relieved she was there with a shield between herself and the crying relatives. Most of her life, Anna had thought herself happier single, but when she'd met Haley 3.5 years ago, the 2 women who didn't settle down for anyone had settled down for each other. She smiled, remembering how there had been heartbroken women everywhere in Brisbane when she'd taken Haley off the market. "Why are you smiling?" Anna shook her head, pulling Haley in for another kiss. "No reason." It wasn't easy to be the partner of someone who was grieving. Haley ghosted around Anna, offering comfort where she could, which was hard with someone who refused to take it. Anna was aware that it must be maddening, but she didn't want to talk. All she wanted was to squash down the feeling that was threatening to swallow her whole. Whenever she pulled Haley to her and crushed their lips together, Haley looked almost relieved. Sex was easier than words, and after 5 days in her parents' house, they learnt to be quiet. She was at a loss when people asked how she was doing, when Haley looked at her in the middle of the night and said, "Babe, you have to be feeling something you want to talk about." Silence was the only answer, as Anna would roll onto her side and pull Haley's arm across her middle. Sleep eluded her, even as she pretended to succumb to it. What could she talk about? Her only sibling had been killed. She didn't have words for losing the man who was half brother, half best friend. It was a bond that had never faded as they'd gotten older. When he'd been shipped overseas, she had gone as crazy as Sally worrying about him. The 2 of them had drunk more wine together than was probably appropriate for sisters-in-law. She wasn't ready to not have her best friend. How would she talk about the look in her mother's eye, or about the scotch she could smell on her father's breath, even as he avoided looking at her, or about how Ella was still quiet, pushing her food around her plate and barely eating, about how poor Toby had started to pick up that something was very wrong, becoming more and more clingy and agitated. He was often calling for Ma and Da, looking confused when it was his grandmother hovering over him, before breaking into the grin he was so good at. How did she talk about how dreading the lawyer's visit the next day to go over the will, about how she didn't want to watch her mother break down and her father stare stoically as their son and daughter-in-law's last will and testament was read. Something about doing that was so very, very final. And soon. Surely it was too soon. And how did she talk about how it felt like a part of her had died too? In between sips of tea, the balding lawyer spoke monotonously, seated across the living room on a chair brought from the kitchen. While Anna was trying to concentrate on the complicated legalese the man spewed forth, it felt like listening to something underwater. She leant heavily against Haley while giving the occasional nod, trusting her hotshot lawyer girlfriend to pay attention for her. Distracted, Anna focused on Sandra's hands, running methodically through Toby's soft brown hair as he slept on the sofa between her parents. The tea in Andrew's lap was probably cold, untouched as he sat ramrod straight. He hadn't blinked once that Anna had noticed. With a twinge of guilt, a part of her longed for this to be over, to go home with her girlfriend and bury herself in work and ignore what had happened. Another part of her just wanted to crawl into bed and never emerge again. She missed Jake. The lawyer cleared his throat, and Anna blinked, forcing herself to look back at him. So, really, the will is summed up fairly easily. Anna Foster is to be left the house in Melbourne and both cars, the remaining car, all assets, both financial and material, are to be transferred into her name. Silence descended upon the room, and the words finally registered in Anna's mind. Sorry, what? Haley's hand, which had been rubbing gently up and down her back, stilled. The lawyer kept going. Custody of Ella and Toby Foster is to go to one Anna Foster, as unanimously agreed by the biological parents. Anna's mouth fell open. She blinked again. The lawyer, the stupid, boring man, looked up from his papers and seemed surprised to see the look on her face. Jake said he spoke of this with you. There was a conversation Anna vaguely recalled. If I die, you'll take the kids, right? She spun on her bar stool, raising an eyebrow at him. We're here toasting the birth of your first kid and you're already talking plural? I'll have more. Have you seen that kid? I make good kids. It's imperative I produce more, little sister. Anna snorted. Oh, yeah, you owe it to mankind. Glad you agree. Now, that's a yes, then. I won't have my kids going to Sally's parents. They're terrifying. Hell, even Sally doesn't want to go near her parents. Mum and Dad can raise them. Besides, you're not dying. Mum and Dad? I love them, but they're old, and the kids don't need old, and Dad's... Dad. He's not warm, Anna. It was just me and you growing up, so that leaves you. Anna threw back a shot and slid one over the bar to Jake. Right, yeah, I'd be great with the kids. Anna stared at the lawyer, mouth still open. Jake Foster, that was not a conversation about me raising your children in your absence. She suddenly felt irrationally pissed that he wasn't there for her to throttle. A glance at her parents told her they weren't surprised. Then she looked at Haley, who was staring at the lawyer with horrified, wide eyes. Anna's world just kept falling apart. Chapter 2. 2 hours on from the meeting with the lawyer, and Anna was still shell-shocked. The silence in the car as she drove Hayley to the airport was pressing in on her ears. Both of them stared numbly at the road, Anna's mind churning over everything, ignoring the fact that her girlfriend had retreated completely inside herself. Focusing on the anger bubbling in her stomach was easier. It probably wasn't healthy to be so mad at her dead brother, but she was, which was almost a relief, because it stopped everything else from overwhelming her. Being angry stopped the feeling that her chest was restricted and she couldn't breathe, the feeling that everything was spinning while she stood still, the feeling that overtook her when she watched her father close his study door and heard the clink of a bottle on glass, or when she caught her mother staring vaguely at a plate, hands covered in drying dishwater. A red light turned green, and it took her too long to notice. A loud horn blasted behind her as she tried to forget the memory of Ella staring wordlessly at her untouched food. Anna accelerated, trying to concentrate, but she couldn't stop thinking of the kids. When she and Hayley had left the house, Anna had had to choke down a lump at the sight of Toby sitting in his sister's lap with a book. Ella's arms had encircled the small toddler, and he'd been gripping his blanket to himself as he leant back against her chest, looking up at her, and then back at the book with captivated eyes. That sight hurt. The fact that those two kids didn't have their parents hurt. A 6-year-old who would forever remember feeling abandoned, and a 15-month-old who wouldn't remember anything. What would happen to them now? Would Ella forever be taking on a role too big for her? Anna's eyes flicked to Hayley, who was steadfastly staring out the window, looking ready to bolt. The worried thought that she would gnawed at Anna, but then anger boiled in her stomach again, overshadowing everything else. How could Jake and Sally put her in this position when they knew damn well how she felt about having kids? The grip she had on the steering wheel turned her knuckles white. Despite what he seemed to think of a random bar conversation, Jake had never spoken about this, had ignored the fact that she didn't want children. Anna's grip on the wheel tightened even more at the implications. This type of commitment was something she had spent her entire life avoiding. Anna had been nervous enough just thinking of buying an apartment with her girlfriend. Jake knew that. Eyes glued to the road, she swallowed heavily, her breathing getting out of control. Jake was dead, and she couldn't even yell at him. Being angry at Jake was easier than being sad about Jake. Anna hit her indicator harder than she intended and drove into the departures section of the airport. The hideous silence was making her feel like crawling out of her skin. "We'll figure this out," she said. Hayley blinked and looked over at her, hand slipping onto Anna's thigh. "We'll figure something out. My parents can take them." Anna found a spot to pull over and killed the engine. They looked at each other, the space wide between them. "Maybe," Hayley hesitated. "They seemed on board with Jake's will. It looks like he may have talked to them about it." Anna suddenly slammed her open palm against the steering wheel. "Damn it, Jake!" Guilt slammed into her stomach as Anna dropped her head back against the headrest. Tears filled her eyes, and she blinked them away. Hayley looked at her, grip tightening. "Hey, like you said, we'll figure it out." Cheeks burning, Anna didn't open her eyes. "I'm sorry I have to go when, well, with everything like this. I'm sorry I have to go so soon. I booked your ticket for 2 days from now. You'll fly back then?" Anna rolled her head to the side, finally looking at Hayley. "Yeah, I'll talk to my parents, figure out what all this actually means." When they slid out of the car, Anna pulled Hayley's bag out of the back, then leant against the passenger door. Hayley moved forward, kissing her once. "I'll call you when I land?" Anna nodded. "Try and survive without the constant sex, hey?" Hayley smiled. Anna rolled her eyes. "It'll be hard." Bag in hand, Hayley started to walk off. Meters away, she paused and turned to look back one last time, head tilted slightly. "It's okay to cry, Anna." Unable to look her in the eye, Anna shrugged, tight-lipped, and Hayley turned away again. Anna watched her walk through the doors before sliding back into the car. Heart thudding, she clutched the steering wheel, started the car, and pulled out too fast, trying to remind herself to pay attention as her stomach turned over. Her reality was inescapable, and her brother must have been insane. Jake had made his decision, but surely she could speak to her parents, tell them it was best they took the kids. They saw them regularly. It made a lot more sense. She was just the fun auntie, and she didn't want this. Kids deserved to be with someone who wanted them. She slammed her hand into the steering wheel again, saying out loud, "Talk to them, but not to me. Makes real sense." She bit her lip. Now she was talking to herself. There was a thought that nagged in the back of her mind. She loved her parents, and she and Jake had been incredibly lucky compared to a lot of other children, but Jake had made it a point to her that he didn't want his kids raised by them. What had he said? Their father wasn't warm? Anna gave a snort of laughter. That was the understatement of the year. Andrew could be a distant, foreboding man. What little physical affection he had given when they were small had stopped quickly. He had kept them at arm's length and expected them to be stoic, non-complaining, quiet children. Her father now expected them to be quiet adults. Anna pulled the car into a spot at a park near her parents' house and rested her head heavily on the steering wheel. A glance at the clock told her she could avoid going back for a little longer, and she shut her eyes tightly as she thought of Jake as a father. She'd been curious about how a man raised with a closed-off father like theirs would be as a parent, but children had changed her brother, had enlivened him. Parenthood had suited him and Sally both. Bright, loving, and warm. Jake had been everything their father was not, loudly encouraging where their father was a harsh disciplinarian. Jake didn't want his kids growing up in that household. That much he'd said. With a sigh, she finally pulled out of the park an hour later. Sally's parents were off the table without even a question, and as Jake had said, that left Anna. These kids were all that remained of her brother, and that thought scared the shit out of her. By the time she pulled into the driveway, the street lights had switched on, and Anna knew the kids would be in bed. Guilt gnawed at her stomach, but she pushed it down. She had no idea what to do about any of this. After letting herself in, she padded softly down the hall to the kitchen, where her mother was pouring cups of tea, as if she'd been waiting for Anna to appear. Anna leant on the centre bar top and rested on her elbows, accepting the mug with a grateful look. "He wanted it to be you, Anna." She looked up and caught her mother's eye, which was red-rimmed and shadowed by dark smudges. "Mum, why? Why would he want it to be me? I live in another city. I've never wanted kids, plus I work god-awful hours." Anna wrapped her fingers around her mug, tilting her head to look at Sandra, who sat down opposite her at the kitchen island. "You don't think I said all of that to him?" Her mother raised an eyebrow playfully. The half-joke didn't even insult Anna. "See? Even you agree with me. I'm as nurturing as a teaspoon. You and I both know you can be nurturing, and, actually, I agree with Jake and Sally's decision." "You don't want the kids?" Surprise caused her to raise her voice, and she glanced upstairs, even though it was late and Ella and Toby were fast asleep. Sandra's look hardened. "Those children mean the world to me. But your brother explained his decision, and it made sense. Your hours are better now that you're out of your internship and residency. You're more settled since you met Hayley. We won't talk about your drinking and partying before then." Anna avoided her mother's eye and sipped her tea. Maybe she had enjoyed herself a touch too much. "You're responsible. Love those kids, and your job can easily be moved to a hospital in Melbourne, or you could move the kids to Brisbane, but I don't think that would be fair." Anna barely managed to push down the urge to throw her tea to the floor and scream hysterically about how unfair all this was. Acting like a child wouldn't solve her problem.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?